The horn of the ferry cut through the fog before Ella Grant even saw the harbor. She had 30 seconds to decide, and she had already made up her mind. She pushed through the crowd at the Lisbon port, with her bag pressed against her chest, her boarding pass gripped so tight the paper had gone soft in her hand. Behind her, a man in a gray coat was watching. He was not moving fast. He did not need to. His eyes tracked her the way a hawk tracks a rabbit that has not yet noticed the sky has gone quiet. Ella did not look back. Looking back was a mistake she had made once before, and it had cost her 2 years of running. She kept her head down and let the crowd swallow her, weaving between suitcases and strollers and a group of tourists arguing over a map. The ticket agent barely looked at her fake name before stamping her pass. She thanked him in a voice that did not shake, even though everything inside her chest was shaking hard enough to rattle her ribs. She made it to the lower deck 3 minutes before departure. She found a corner behind a stack of crates and sat down on the cold metal floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and for the first time in 6 hours, she let herself breathe. Her phone buzzed. She almost did not check it. She had promised herself in Marrakesh that she would stop checking it, that every time she looked at that screen, she was inviting the past back into her present. But some old habit, some leftover thread of hope, made her thumb move anyway. One new message. No name. Just a string of numbers she recognized instantly, because she had memorized it the way people memorize the sound of a gunshot. 3 words. That was all it said. I found you. Her stomach dropped the way it does when an elevator falls faster than the cable can hold. She stood so fast her head spun, and she pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the ship, scanning every face on the lower deck like each one might be wearing a disguise. Nobody who worked for Victor Hale needed a disguise. That was the first thing she had learned. They did not hide. They let you see them coming, because fear was the whole point. Fear made you run in the direction they wanted. The ferry engine roared to life beneath her feet. The deck shuddered. Through a small round window, she watched the dock pull away, watched the gray-coated man standing perfectly still at the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, not chasing, not shouting, just watching her leave the way a man watches weather roll out to sea, knowing full well it will come back around. She had 5 years of practice reading a room in half a second, and this was not the king's man. Daniel Cross did not send men who stood still. Daniel Cross sent men who ran straight through walls to reach her, because that was the only way his kind knew how to love anything. No, the man on the dock belonged to someone else, someone who did not want her found so much as he wanted her returned, the way a stolen object gets returned to a shelf it was never allowed to leave. She sat back down on the cold floor and pulled her knees tighter. Somewhere out on the black water, gulls screamed at the ferry's wake, and Ella Grant, who used to be called something else entirely, closed her eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to simply be a person nobody was hunting. She could not remember. It had been too long. The crossing to the northern coast of Morocco took 4 hours. Ella spent most of it awake, watching the door to the lower deck, counting footsteps, timing the gaps between when the crew walked past to check tickets. She had gotten good at counting. Counting kept the panic in a small enough box that she could carry it without spilling. When the ferry finally docked, she moved fast, blending into a wave of passengers heading toward the taxi stand. She had a room booked under a name that was not hers, in a part of the city where nobody asked questions if you paid in cash and kept your head down. The apartment was small, above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of warm bread every morning at 5. She had been there 3 weeks. 3 weeks was already longer than she usually let herself stay anywhere, but something about the quiet had made her greedy for a few more days. That greed, she now understood, was a mistake. She barely slept that first night back. She lay on the thin mattress, listening to the pipes groan in the walls, replaying that message over and over. I found you. 3 words. No threat attached, because a threat would have meant explaining, and men who worked for Victor Hale did not explain. They simply arrived. By morning, she had already packed her bag again. She took the coastal road out of the city on a bus, crowded with workers and market sellers, sitting near the back where she could watch the aisle. An old woman beside her offered her a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, and Ella took it because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. The bread was warm. It tasted like the first normal thing she had experienced in days, and for one dangerous second, she let herself imagine a life where a piece of warm bread on a bus was simply a piece of warm bread and not something she would remember later as the last calm moment before everything caught fire. She should have known better than to enjoy anything. The universe, in her experience, did not like being enjoyed around. The bus stopped outside a small coastal town 2 hours later, and Ella stepped off into a heat that pressed against her skin like a hand. She had a contact here, a woman named Grace who ran a guest house and asked no questions, who had helped her disappear once before in a different country under a different name. Grace's guest house sat at the edge of town, blue shutters against white walls, laundry strung between two posts, snapping in the wind off the water. Ella knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. It was the signal they had agreed on years ago, back when Ella still believed that signals and codes could keep her safe. Grace opened the door and did not smile. She simply stepped back to let her in, already scanning the street behind her. "You look thinner," Grace said, closing the door and sliding the bolt. "I've been busy not dying," Ella said. Grace almost laughed. "Almost. Come in. Eat something. You can tell me who is chasing you this time while I make tea." They sat in the small kitchen while the kettle heated, and Ella told her about the message. Grace's face did not change, but her hands stilled over the teacups for just a moment too long. "Victor's men do not send warnings for fun," Grace said finally. "If they told you they found you, it means they want you to run. It means they are hurting you somewhere." "Hurting me where?" Grace poured the tea and did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone low, careful, the way people speak when they are about to say something they wish were not true. "There is only one direction Victor would want to push you," Grace said, "toward him, or toward the king, and knowing Victor, he would rather it be toward himself." Ella's hands tightened around the warm cup. 5 years. 5 years of building a life out of borrowed names and midnight buses and quiet rooms above bakeries, and it had taken 3 words on a phone screen to remind her that none of it had ever been real safety. It had only ever been a pause. She thought of Daniel Cross for the first time in weeks and hated herself a little for how her chest tightened at the memory of him. Not fear, something else entirely, something she had spent 5 years trying to bury under new names and new cities and new versions of herself. She pushed the thought down hard. That night, Grace gave her a room at the back of the guest house, farthest from the road, with a window that opened onto the sea instead of the street. Ella lay awake, listening to the waves, trying to convince herself that the sound of water was not the sound of something closing in. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to the sound of Grace's voice, sharp and urgent, calling her name from downstairs. Ella was on her feet before she was fully awake, pulling on her shoes, grabbing her bag from beside the bed out of pure instinct. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped. Grace stood in the doorway of the guest house, blocking it with her whole body, and beyond her, out on the sunlit street, stood 3 men Ella had never seen before, and one she recognized immediately because she had spent 2 years of her life learning every detail of his face just so she would know exactly when to run. Owen, one of Victor Hale's oldest enforcers, the kind of man who did not raise his voice because he never needed to. He was not looking at Grace. He was looking straight up the stairs at Ella, and for the first time since she had left everything behind, his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Hello, Lunara," he said, using the name she had buried 5 years ago in a country she never planned to see again. "Victor sends his regards. He would very much like you to come home." Ella's whole body went cold, and then, in the space of a single heartbeat, hot with something close to fury. She had run across an ocean and a continent to keep that name buried, and this man had just dug it up on Grace's front step like it cost him nothing at all. Behind Owen, a car door opened, and Ella understood, all at once, exactly how much danger she was standing in. She had one door behind her, a window she was not sure she could survive jumping from, and 3 men between her and the only road out of town. For the first time in 5 years, running was not going to be enough. Grace did not move from the doorway. "Owen," she said, her voice flat and hard, "you are not welcome here. This is neutral ground and you know it. Neutral ground only matters to men who respect borders," Owen said, still watching Ella at the top of the stairs. "Victor Hale has stopped respecting anything that stands between him and what belongs to him." "I do not belong to him," Ella said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands were shaking at her sides. "I never did." Owen tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he hears something he finds mildly amusing. That is not how he remembers it. And frankly, it does not matter how you remember it either. What matters is that he wants you back, and I have been sent to make sure that happens quietly or loudly. The choice is yours. Ella's mind raced through every exit she had ever mapped in her head for a moment exactly like this one. The window in her room faced the sea, a 2-story drop onto rocks slick with morning spray. The back door of the guest house led into a narrow alley that connected to the market street, but that alley was barely wide enough for one person, and she did not know if it dead-ended. She had seconds, not minutes, to choose. "Grace," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Owen. "The back door." Grace did not hesitate. She stepped back from the doorway just enough to block Owen's view for half a second, and that half a second was all Ella needed. She turned and ran through the kitchen, knocking a chair aside, shoving through the narrow back door into the alley beyond. The alley smelled of fish and salt and old stone. Ella's feet pounded against the uneven ground as she ran, her lungs burning, her bag slamming against her hip with every stride. Behind her she heard shouting, heard the guest house door slam open, heard boots on stone gaining ground with a speed that no ordinary man should have been able to manage. She did not look back. Looking back had never once helped her run faster. The alley opened onto the market street, crowded with vendors setting up their morning stalls, baskets of oranges and stacks of woven cloth, and the noise of 100 voices bargaining at once. Ella plunged into the crowd, weaving between stalls, praying the chaos would slow the men behind her even a little. It did not slow them enough. A hand closed around her arm from behind, fingers like iron, and Ella twisted hard, driving her elbow back into the ribs of the man who had grabbed her. He grunted but did not let go. She recognized his face now, one of the 3 men who had stood behind Owen on the street, younger than Owen, with a jaw set in the same cold patience. "Let go of me," she said, low and sharp. "Victor wants you breathing," the man said. "He did not say anything about you being comfortable." She stomped down hard on his foot and twisted free, stumbling into a stall of clay pots that toppled and shattered across the stone ground. The vendor shouted in protest. Ella did not stop to apologize. She ran, cutting left down a narrow lane between 2 buildings, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. She did not know this town well enough to know where the lane led. That was the problem with running your whole life. You never had time to learn the map before you had to use it. The lane spilled out onto a small square with a fountain in the center, dry and cracked from years of sun, and beyond it, a road leading up toward the hills. Ella sprinted for the road, lungs screaming, legs shaking with the effort of pure terror translated into motion. A car engine roared behind her. She glanced back just once and saw the vehicle Owen's men had arrived in, cutting across the square, tires screeching against old stone. She was not going to outrun a car on foot. She knew that with the cold, clear certainty of someone who had run out of options. She veered off the road into a thicket of low trees at the edge of the hillside, hoping the vehicle could not follow her there, hoping the ground would slow it even if it could not stop the men on foot entirely. Branches tore at her arms as she pushed through, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind screaming at her to keep moving, do not stop. Behind her she heard the car door slam and boots hit the ground, and then a new sound entered the chaos. One she had not expected, one that made her chest seize with something that was not quite fear. A howl, low, controlled, deliberate, cutting through the morning air like a blade. It was not Owen's voice. It was not the voice of any man who worked for Victor Hale. Ella knew that howl the way she knew her own heartbeat, because she had heard it every single day for 2 years of her life, in a place she had run from and never once let herself remember out loud. Daniel Cross had found her. She did not know whether to feel relieved or more afraid than she had ever been, because the last time she had heard that voice this close, she had been running from him just as hard as she was running from Victor Hale now. She kept moving through the thicket, branches scraping her face, her mind spinning through impossible questions. How had he found her here, in this town, on this morning, at the exact moment Victor's men had cornered her? There was no such thing as coincidence in a world like the one she had left behind. Someone had told him where she was. Someone had been watching her long before Owen ever knocked on Grace's door. She broke free of the thicket onto a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, and there was nowhere left to run. Behind her, the trees rustled violently as men crashed through them in pursuit. Below her, a cliff dropped 40 feet to jagged rocks and churning water. She turned, chest heaving, and watched as Owen emerged from the thicket first, 2 of his men flanking him, all 3 breathing hard from the chase, but wearing expressions of grim satisfaction, the look of men who believed the hunt was finally over. "Nowhere left to run, little wolf," Owen said, stepping closer. "Victor said you would put up a good chase. He always did admire that about you." Ella backed toward the cliff edge, weighing the fall against the men in front of her, doing the terrible math of a person deciding which danger might actually let her survive. Before she could decide, the air behind Owen's men seemed to shift, a pressure dropping over the clearing, like the moment before lightning strikes, and then Daniel Cross stepped out of the trees behind them, and everything about the scene changed in an instant. He did not look like the man from her memories. He looked older, harder, his jaw set in a line that had nothing gentle left in it. His eyes found her first, just for a heartbeat, something raw and unguarded passing over his face, before it vanished behind a mask of cold command. Then he looked at Owen, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "You are on the wrong coast, Owen," Daniel said, "and you have made the mistake of putting your hands on something that is under my protection." Owen did not flinch, but his men shifted their weight, glancing between Daniel and their leader with the uneasy look of men recalculating the odds. "She belongs to Victor Hale," Owen said. "That has not changed just because you decided to play hero 5 years too late." Daniel's expression did not change, but something in the clearing did, a tension that pulled tight, like a wire about to snap. Ella had seen this before, had lived beside it for 2 years, and she knew exactly what came next if nobody stepped back. "She belongs to no one," Ella said, loud enough to cut through the standoff. "Both of you can stop talking about me like I am a piece of property that changed hands in a card game." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Owen's mouth curved into that same thin, humorless smile from the guest house doorway. "We will finish this conversation another time," he said, stepping back slowly, his men following his lead. "Victor will be very interested to hear that the king has finally decided to leave his own territory to chase a woman who ran from him first." They retreated into the trees, and within moments, the sound of the car engine roared to life again, tires spinning against gravel, before fading into the distance. Ella stood at the edge of the cliff, breathing hard, staring at the man who had just saved her life, and who she had spent 5 years running from in equal measure. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The sea crashed against the rocks below, and somewhere above them, a gull screamed once and went silent. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice rough, quieter than before. "You look thin," he said, echoing Grace's words from the night before, and something about the repetition made Ella want to laugh and cry at the same time. "You look older," she said. 5 years will do that." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how close she was standing to the edge of the cliff, and stepped back onto solid ground. "I did not ask you to come find me." "I know," Daniel said. "I came anyway." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face cracked open just slightly, enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath the crown he wore like armor. "Because Victor Hale does not send men across an ocean for a woman he does not still consider his. And because if I had waited one more day to reach you, that cliff behind you might have been the last thing you ever saw." Ella did not answer right away. She looked past him, toward the trees where Owen and his men had vanished, and felt the cold certainty settle over her that this was not over, that it had perhaps only just begun. "We need to move," Daniel said, reading the look on her face correctly. "He will regroup. He will come back with more men, and next time he will not send someone who talks first and grabs second." Ella hesitated only a moment before nodding. Whatever she felt about Daniel Cross, whatever old wounds his presence had reopened in the space of 5 minutes, she was not foolish enough to stand on an open cliff waiting to find out which version of danger reached her first. They walked back through the thicket together, not touching, not speaking, two people who had once meant everything to each other, now moving like careful strangers, through a battlefield neither of them had chosen to stand on again. Grace was waiting at the guest house, the front door still hanging slightly open from where Owen's men had pushed through it. Her eyes went wide at the sight of Daniel Cross standing beside Ella, but she did not ask questions. She simply stepped aside and let them both in. "We do not have much time," Grace said, already moving to pack a bag of supplies from the kitchen. "Owen will not come back with 3 men next time. He will come back with 15. Where can she go that he cannot follow?" Daniel asked. Grace paused, glancing between the two of them with an expression Ella could not quite read. "There is nowhere Victor Hale cannot eventually follow," she said, "but there is a place across the sea, far from here, where an old friend of mine keeps watch over travelers who need to disappear for a while. It will take 3 flights and 2 false names to get there, but it can be done." "Then that is where we go," Daniel said. "We," Ella repeated, arching an eyebrow despite everything. "I did not cross 3 continents to leave you alone on the 4th, Daniel said, and there was no arguing with the certainty in his voice. No room left for the old fights they had once had about freedom and belonging, and what it meant to choose a life instead of being handed one. Ella looked at him for a long moment, weighing 5 years of careful distance against the very real fact that Victor Hale's men had found her twice in 2 days, and that alone she had almost lost. "Fine," she said finally, "but this does not mean I am coming home with you. This means I am surviving with you. There is a difference, and I need you to understand that difference before we take one more step together." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Understood." Grace handed them both a bag of supplies and a slip of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. "Go now," she said. "And Ella, whatever happens next, know that you always have a door here that opens for you and nobody else." Ella hugged her tightly, longer than she meant to, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet in a way she refused to acknowledge out loud. They left through the back alley, avoiding the main road, moving fast and quiet toward the edge of town, where Daniel had a car waiting, hidden behind an abandoned warehouse. As they climbed inside and pulled away from the town that had almost become her grave, Ella allowed herself one single backward glance at the coastline disappearing behind them. Somewhere out there, Victor Hale was already planning his next move, and somewhere ahead of them, an ocean and a continent away, a danger far older than anything Owen's men could offer was waiting for her to arrive. She did not know it yet, but the quiet life she had been chasing for 5 years had just become the one thing standing furthest out of her reach. The first flight took them to Madrid, then Istanbul, then finally to Busan, a city Ella had never once considered visiting in her old life, back when her world had been small enough to fit inside the borders of one territory ruled by one man. Now her world had grown so large it had nowhere left to hide her, and that thought alone kept her awake through most of the second flight, staring out at clouds lit orange by a sunset she did not feel like admiring. Daniel sat beside her, silent for most of the journey, occasionally glancing at his phone when messages came through from people Ella did not recognize by name, but understood immediately by role. Enforcers, scouts. The machinery of a king protecting his territory extended now across an ocean to protect one runaway woman who had spent 5 years insisting she wanted nothing to do with any of it. Somewhere over the Mediterranean, she finally spoke, her voice barely above the hum of the engines. "Why did it take you 5 years?" she asked. Daniel did not look up from his phone right away. When he finally did, his expression was unreadable, careful in a way that told Ella he had rehearsed this answer more than once in his head, waiting for the moment she would finally ask. "I looked for you the first year," he said. "Every territory, every ally pack, every human city with a large enough wolf population to hide in. I found nothing. You were careful. I had good teachers," Ella said, thinking of Grace, of the dozen other quiet allies who had helped her vanish over and over again. "The second year," Daniel continued, "I told myself you were dead. It was easier than believing you had simply chosen to disappear from a life I thought we were building together. And the third year," Ella asked, though some part of her did not want to hear the answer. "The third year, Victor Hale's pack went quiet," Daniel said. "No raids, no border disputes, nothing. A king who goes quiet for that long is either dying or planning something, and I did not have the resources to investigate both possibilities while also chasing a woman who clearly did not want to be found." Ella turned her face back toward the window, watching the clouds shift beneath them. "So what changed?" "3 months ago, one of my scouts intercepted a message meant for Victor's network," Daniel said. "It mentioned your name, your old name. It said Victor had a way to locate you, something involving a debt someone in your old pack owed him, and that once he found you, he intended to bring you back not as a wife, but as an example." Ella's stomach turned cold. An example of what? Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the cliff, she saw real fear cross his face, quick and sharp before he buried it again. "An example of what happens to anyone who thinks they can leave him and survive it," Daniel said quietly. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. Ella pressed her forehead against the cool window and closed her eyes, letting the weight of that sentence settle over her like a stone she had been carrying without knowing its exact size until now. They landed in Busan just after midnight local time, the city glittering below them in a sprawl of light that felt both anonymous and impossibly exposed all at once. Grace's contact met them at a quiet gate away from the main terminal, a woman named Mira who ran a small clinic in the old part of the city and asked no questions about the 2 exhausted travelers who arrived carrying only 2 bags and a folded slip of paper with her address written on it. Mira's clinic sat above a noodle shop that stayed open until 3 in the morning, filling the stairwell with the smell of broth and garlic long after the streets outside had gone quiet. She gave them a small room at the back with 2 cots and a single window overlooking an alley, and told them to rest, because whatever they were running from, exhaustion would only make them slower. Ella did not expect to sleep. She lay on the cot with her eyes open, listening to Daniel's breathing across the small room, steady and controlled even in the dark, and found herself thinking, against every instinct she had built over 5 years, about what it had felt like to fall asleep beside him once, back before Victor Hale's shadow had swallowed everything good she had ever tried to build. She must have drifted off eventually, because she woke to the sound of raised voices downstairs, Mira's voice sharp with alarm, and another voice, deep and unfamiliar, cutting through the noodle shop's usual late-night chatter like a blade through cloth. Ella was on her feet instantly, Daniel already awake and moving toward the door before she had even fully processed the sound. He held up a hand, silent, listening. "Stay here," he whispered. "Absolutely not," Ella whispered back, already reaching for her bag. They crept to the top of the stairwell together, and through the gap in the doorway, Ella saw a sight that made her blood run cold in a way that Owen's men, for all their menace, had never quite managed. Victor Hale stood in the middle of the noodle shop, flanked by 6 men, his silver hair catching the low light of the hanging lanterns, his expression calm in the specific way that only truly dangerous men ever manage to achieve. Mira stood behind her counter, arms crossed, refusing to move, though Ella could see the fear tightening the muscles of her jaw. "I am simply looking for an old friend," Victor was saying, his voice smooth, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of sounding reasonable while doing unreasonable things. "I have reason to believe she passed through your clinic recently." "I do not discuss my patients," Mira said. Victor smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Of course not. Very professional. I would expect nothing less from someone Grace trusts." Ella's heart slammed against her ribs at the mention of Grace's name, and beside her, she felt Daniel go rigid, a low sound building in his chest that was not quite a growl, but was heading in that direction fast. "We need to move, now," Daniel whispered, pulling her back from the stairwell gap. "There is no back exit," Ella whispered back, her mind racing through the layout of the clinic she had only seen for a few hours. "This building only has the one stairwell and the window in our room." "Then the window it is," Daniel said. They moved fast, back into the small room, Daniel already forcing the window open despite the narrow gap and the 2-story drop into the alley below. Ella's mind flashed back to the cliff, to the impossible choice she had faced there, and she felt a bitter, exhausted laugh building in her throat at the realization that her entire life now seemed to consist of impossible choices between 2 different kinds of falling. "You first," Daniel said, already helping her through the narrow frame. Below them, the alley was dark, littered with crates, and the smell of old cooking oil, and Ella dropped the final few feet with a jolt that rattled up through her ankles. She turned just in time to see Daniel drop down beside her, silent and controlled despite the height, landing in a low crouch that reminded her, uncomfortably, of exactly what he was underneath the tailored coat and careful human manners. They moved down the alley fast, and behind them, Ella heard the noodle shop door burst open, heard Victor's voice rise for the first time, sharp and commanding, no longer bothering with the gentle mask he had worn for Mira's benefit. "Find them," he snapped. "She is here. I can smell her." They ran. The alley spilled onto a wider street lined with closed shops and flickering neon signs, and Daniel pulled her sideways into a narrow passage between 2 buildings, pressing her back against the cold brick, his body angled to block her from view of the street behind them. Ella's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Daniel's breath came fast and controlled beside her, his eyes fixed on the mouth of the alley, watching for movement. "I have never seen him move that fast," Ella whispered. "He does not chase things himself. He always sends men to do it for him. He is not chasing a thing," Daniel said quietly, without looking at her. "He is chasing the one person who ever made him feel like he did not own the whole world. That is different. That is personal." Footsteps echoed from the street, slow, deliberate, and Ella recognized the rhythm of that walk instantly. The same unhurried confidence Owen had carried on the coast, except heavier now, older, colder. "Come out, little wolf," Victor's voice called, close enough now that Ella felt the sound of it crawl up her spine like ice water. "I only want to talk. Is that so much to ask after everything I gave you?" Ella's hands curled into fists at her sides, 5 years of buried anger rising up through her chest, so fast it nearly stole her breath. Beside her, Daniel's whole body had gone still and tense, every muscle coiled, waiting. "You gave me nothing," Ella whispered under her breath, too quiet for Victor to hear, but loud enough that Daniel turned to look at her, something unreadable passing across his face in the darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside the mouth of the alley. For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved, and Ella held her breath so tightly her lungs began to ache. Then, from somewhere further down the street, a car alarm blared to life, sharp and sudden, and Victor's footsteps turned away from the alley, moving toward the noise instead, his voice calling out orders to his men in a language Ella did not recognize but understood the tone of perfectly. They waited 3 full minutes after the sound of Victor's men faded before either of them dared to breathe normally again. "That was too close," Daniel said finally, his voice rough. "He knows I am in this city now," Ella said. "He will not stop until he finds every corner of it. Then we do not stay in this city," Daniel said. "We move again, tonight, before he expands the search." Ella nodded. Exhaustion and fear tangled so tightly together in her chest that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. As they crept back toward the main road, careful to avoid the noodle shop entirely, she found herself gripping the sleeve of Daniel's coat without fully realizing she had reached for him at all. He did not pull away. If anything, his hand found hers in the dark, steady and warm, and for one brief moment, in the middle of the most dangerous night of her life, Ella let herself hold on. They found Mira 2 streets over, hiding in the back room of a closed pharmacy, shaking but unharmed. She told them Victor's men had torn through the clinic looking for any sign of where they had gone, but had found nothing, because Mira, true to her word, had told them nothing at all. "You cannot stay anywhere near this city," Mira said, pressing a small folded map into Daniel's hand. "There is a fishing village 2 hours north. Quiet, mostly forgotten by anyone who matters. My cousin runs a boat repair shop there. He will not ask questions if you tell him I sent you." Ella hugged her tightly before they left, the same way she had hugged Grace 2 days and a lifetime ago, and as they walked away from the city center toward a borrowed car Daniel had arranged through yet another quiet ally, Ella felt something shift inside her chest that she had not expected. She had spent 5 years believing that running alone was the only way to survive. But tonight, in that narrow alley with Victor Hale's voice crawling toward her in the dark, she had not been alone. And for the first time since she had left everything behind, she was not entirely certain that being alone had ever actually kept her safe at all. The drive north was quiet, the headlights cutting through a darkness broken only by the occasional passing truck. Ella watched the city lights fade behind them in the side mirror, and finally allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding since the cliff. "What happens if he catches us?" she asked. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "He will not. That is not an answer." He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "If he catches us," he said finally, "I intend to make sure it is the last mistake he ever makes. But I would prefer we never find out whether I am capable of keeping that promise." Ella looked out at the darkness rushing past the window and said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say that would make either of them feel any safer than they actually were, which was to say, not safe at all. The fishing village Mira had sent them to sat tucked against a rocky coastline, its houses painted in faded blues and greens, its harbor filled with small wooden boats that rocked gently against the dock in the early morning light. Mira's cousin, a quiet man named Sam, gave them a room above his boat repair shop without asking a single question, only nodding when Daniel mentioned Mira's name, as though that alone explained everything he needed to know. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. No messages, no strange men watching from doorways, no howls cutting through the morning air. Ella spent the time helping Sam repaint the hull of an old fishing boat, grateful for the mindless, repetitive work that gave her hands something to do besides shake. Daniel spent those 2 days on the phone, coordinating with allies across 3 countries, piecing together where Victor Hale's search had spread and where it had gone quiet. Ella watched him from a distance sometimes, struck by how different he looked here, sleeves rolled up, hair messier than she remembered, nothing at all like the composed king who had once ruled a territory with a calm word and an even calmer stare. On the 3rd evening, she found him sitting alone on the dock, watching the sun sink into the water, and she sat down beside him without asking permission, because 5 years of running had taught her that permission was often just another word for waiting too long. "You have not asked me why I left," she said. Daniel did not look at her right away. "I assumed you would tell me when you were ready. I did not want to force it out of you the way everyone else in your life seemed determined to force things out of you." Ella almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "That is either the kindest or the most frustrating thing anyone has ever said to me." Perhaps it is both, Daniel said, finally turning to look at her. She stared out at the water for a long moment, gathering the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her head, but had never once said out loud to another living person. When she finally spoke, her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Victor Hale was not always the alpha of his own pack, she said. Before him, there was another man, someone I trusted, someone who taught me everything I knew about what it meant to belong somewhere. Victor took that pack from him in a fight that was supposed to be honorable and was not. And when Victor won, he decided that everything the old alpha had, including the people who once belonged to him, now belonged to Victor instead. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet, letting her continue at her own pace. I was young, Ella said, young enough to believe that surviving him meant staying close enough that he never had a reason to remind me what he was capable of. I spent 2 years learning exactly how small I needed to make myself in order to be safe. And then one night, he decided small was not enough anymore, and I understood that there was no version of staying that would ever end in anything except disappearing completely, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left of me to disappear. She stopped there, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, and did not elaborate further, because there were some sentences that did not need a paragraph of explanation trailing behind them to be understood completely. Daniel's hand found hers in the fading light, and this time neither of them pulled away. I am sorry, he said quietly, not because sorry fixes anything, sorry never fixes anything, but because you deserved someone who noticed sooner, and I was too busy trying to build a kingdom to notice that the person I loved most inside it was quietly disappearing right in front of me. Ella turned to look at him, something raw and unguarded passing between them in the dying light. You noticed eventually. 5 years too late, Daniel said. You are here now, she said. That has to count for something. He studied her face for a long moment, and for the first time since the airport in Lisbon, Ella let herself really look at him too, not as a threat, or a complication, or an old wound reopening, but as the man she had once built a life with, before fear had convinced her that life was something she needed to survive alone. It counts for everything, Daniel said finally. It just does not undo what came before it. No, Ella agreed. It does not. They sat together on the dock as the last light faded from the sky, and for a little while, neither of them spoke of Victor Hale, or Owen, or the ocean of danger still spread out between them and anything resembling safety. For a little while it was simply two people who had once loved each other, sitting quietly beside the sea, allowing themselves the smallest possible version of peace. That peace lasted exactly one more day. On the 4th morning, Sam came up to their room before sunrise, his face pale, a folded piece of paper clutched in his hand. Someone left this outside the shop overnight, he said, holding it out to Daniel. I did not open it. I did not want to know what was inside something meant for you. Daniel unfolded the paper slowly, and Ella watched his expression shift from careful neutrality to something colder, harder, as he read the message written in careful, deliberate handwriting. What does it say? She asked. Daniel handed it to her without a word. It was short, only a few lines, but each one landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of Ella's chest. I know where you are. I know who protects you now. There is a gathering of pack leaders in 3 days' time, arranged long before either of you arrived here, and I will be attending as I always do. Bring her, and we will settle this the way our kind has always settled disputes over territory and belonging. Refuse, and I will simply take her from wherever you hide her next, and this time I will not send Owen to ask nicely. Ella's hands shook as she lowered the paper. He knows about the gathering. He knows you are supposed to attend. Every pack leader within 1,000 miles attends that gathering, Daniel said grimly. It has been arranged for months. There is no way to avoid it without every ally I have questioning why the king suddenly refuses to appear. So we do not go, Ella said. If we do not go, Daniel said, he will simply hunt us down somewhere with no witnesses and no rules at all. At least at the gathering, there are conventions, old laws even Victor Hale has never dared to break in public. because doing so would turn every neutral pack in the region against him. "And if he breaks them anyway?" Ella asked. Daniel did not answer right away, and his silence told her everything the words could not. They spent the rest of that day preparing, Daniel reaching out to allies who would be attending the gathering, carefully building a version of the truth that would protect Ella without exposing the full weight of what Victor Hale had done to her all those years ago. Ella, for her part, found herself doing something she had not done in 5 years of running. She stopped preparing to disappear and started preparing to stay. That evening, she sat across from Daniel at the small table in their room, a map of the gathering location spread between them, marked with entrances and exits and the names of allies who might be persuaded to stand beside them if things went wrong. "If Victor tries anything at the gathering," she said, "I am not hiding behind you while it happens. I spent 5 years hiding. I am done with that particular skill." Daniel looked up at her, something like pride and fear tangled together behind his eyes. "That is not weakness I am asking you to hide," he said. "It is protection I am offering because I love you. Those are not the same thing." "I know the difference now," Ella said. "I did not always. But I know it now. And I am telling you, as someone who finally understands that difference, that I intend to stand on my own feet when Victor Hale walks into that room, because the version of me who disappears the moment danger enters a space is a version I buried on a cliff in Morocco 3 days ago, and I have no intention of digging her back up." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them. "Then we walk in together," he said. "Not as a king protecting something he owns, as two people who intend to walk out of that room exactly the way we walked in." Ella nodded, and for the first time since Owen had knocked on Grace's door, she felt something steady settle into her chest where fear had lived for 5 straight years. 3 days, she said. Then we find out whether Victor Hale still believes the world owes him everything he wants. 3 days, Daniel agreed, and then we make sure he learns otherwise. Outside, the sea continued its endless rhythm against the rocks, indifferent to kings and enforcers, and women who had spent half a decade learning how to vanish. Somewhere across that same water, in a city Ella had never visited and hoped never to see, Victor Hale was already gathering the pieces of a plan 5 years in the making, certain that this time nothing would slip through his fingers. He had no idea that the woman he intended to reclaim had stopped being someone who could be reclaimed at all. The gathering hall stood on a hillside overlooking the city, an old stone building that had hosted pack leaders for generations, long before Ella had ever been born into the world she now understood better than most humans ever would. Cars lined the gravel drive as they arrived, dark and expensive, each one belonging to a leader who ruled some corner of territory Ella had spent her whole life trying to avoid. Daniel walked beside her up the stone steps, his hand steady at the small of her back, not guiding her, simply present, the way a person stands beside someone they refuse to let walk into danger alone. Ella wore a plain dark coat, nothing that marked her as anything other than a guest, though she knew the moment she stepped through those doors, every set of eyes in the room would know exactly who she was. The great hall inside was already filling with pack leaders and their attendants, the air thick with the low murmur of a dozen quiet conversations, and the particular tension that came from powerful people forced to be polite to each other, for the sake of old traditions none of them fully believed in anymore. Ella scanned the room and found him almost instantly, standing near the far wall, silver hair catching the light from the tall windows, Owen at his side. Victor Hale did not rush toward them. He simply watched, the same patient, predatory stillness she remembered from the guest house doorway, and Ella felt her chest tighten with a fear that no longer had room to grow, because she had spent the last 3 days filling every available space inside her with something closer to resolve. The gathering began with the usual formalities, territory disputes and trade agreements discussed in careful, measured tones by leaders who had learned centuries ago how to disguise threats as diplomacy. Ella sat beside Daniel through most of it, hands folded in her lap, aware of Victor's eyes finding her again and again across the room, like a man checking that a possession had not slipped away from its shelf. It was nearly 2 hours before Victor finally rose to speak, and when he did, the room went quiet, in the particular way that happens when everyone present understands that the real conversation is finally about to begin. "I have a matter of personal concern to raise before this gathering," Victor said, his voice smooth and reasonable, the same voice he had used on Mira in the noodle shop. "Some years ago, a member of my pack left without permission, taking with her certain debts and obligations that were never properly settled. I understand she now sits in this very room, under the protection of a king who has decided that our old laws no longer apply to him." Every eye in the hall turned toward Ella and Daniel. Ella kept her spine straight and her hands still, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she wondered if the wolves nearest her could hear it. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the anger Ella had expected, only a cold, deliberate calm that somehow felt far more dangerous. "The woman you are referring to is not a debt," Daniel said. "She is not property, and she is not an obligation. She is a person who left your pack because you gave her every reason in the world to run, and I would ask this gathering to consider very carefully what it says about a leader who chases a woman across 3 continents rather than simply letting her live the life she chose for herself." A murmur rippled through the hall. Victor's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "You speak of choice," Victor said, as though the word amused him, "but she made her choice under my protection, in my territory, bound by agreements that predate whatever affection you believe entitles you to interfere. I am not here to argue sentiment. I am here to invoke the old right of reclamation, which every leader in this room knows still stands in our traditions, whether it is convenient for you or not." "The old right of reclamation," Daniel repeated, his jaw tight. "A tradition built for wolves who left in cowardice, taking pack resources with them. Not for women who fled violence disguised as leadership." "That is a serious accusation," Victor said, his voice going quiet in a way that felt far more threatening than shouting would have. "Do you have proof of these violent claims, or only the word of a woman who has spent 5 years running from consequences she does not wish to face?" Ella felt something inside her chest crack open, hot and sharp, 5 years of silence rising up all at once with nowhere left to go but out. She stood before Daniel could answer for her. "I do not need proof for this room," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall despite the tremor she refused to let show in her hands. "I only need proof for myself, and I have carried that proof in the shape of every city I have ever had to flee, every name I have ever had to abandon, every night I spent unable to sleep because I was afraid a knock at the door meant Victor Hale had finally caught up with me. I do not owe this gathering an explanation of what he did to make me run. I only owe myself the truth of never going back." The hall had gone completely silent. Victor's expression flickered, just once, something like genuine fury breaking through the calm mask he had worn for the entire gathering. "You dare stand in this hall and slander me," he said, his voice dropping low, dangerous. "I dare stand in this hall and tell the truth," Ella said, "something you have clearly never learned to recognize, given how comfortable you are calling it slander instead." Victor took a step forward, and beside him, Owen shifted, tension coiling through the room like static before a storm. Daniel moved instantly, placing himself half a step in front of Ella, though he did not push her back, did not silence her, simply stood ready beside her the way he had promised on the dock 3 nights before. "Careful, Victor Hale," said an older voice from across the hall, one Ella did not recognize. "This gathering operates under laws of neutrality that predate your pack and mine both. If you intend to challenge a claim of reclamation, you know the proper channel is combat, not intimidation dressed up as tradition." Victor's eyes flicked toward the older leader, and for a moment, something calculating passed behind his gaze, as though he were recalculating the odds of the room turning against him if he pushed too hard too fast. "Then let us settle it the proper way," Victor said finally, his voice regaining its smooth, reasonable tone, though nothing about his eyes matched it. "I challenge the king's claim of protection. Let combat decide whether she remains under his shelter or returns to mine." A ripple of tension moved through the gathered leaders. Ella's stomach dropped, understanding instantly what Victor had just done, turning her entire life into a wager settled not by words or law, but by violence between two men, exactly the way he had always solved every problem that stood between him and what he believed belonged to him. "I accept," Daniel said, before Ella could even open her mouth to object. "No," Ella said sharply, turning to face him. "This is exactly what he wants. He does not fight fair. He never has." "Then I will simply have to make sure I do not give him the chance to fight at all," Daniel said quietly, his eyes steady on hers. "I told you once already. I did not cross 3 continents to hand you back to a man who taught you fear as a way of life. I am not about to hand you back to him now because I am afraid of a fight." Ella's eyes burned, though she refused to let the tears fall in front of a room full of pack leaders who were already watching her like she was a prize about to change hands. She grabbed Daniel's sleeve, pulling him close enough that only he could hear her next words. "If something happens to you," she whispered, "I will never forgive either of us for letting this happen the old way, when we both know there had to be another option." "There is another option," Daniel murmured back. "It is called winning." The combat was set for the courtyard behind the hall, under the old laws that governed such disputes, witnessed by every leader present to ensure neither side could claim unfair advantage once the fight began. Ella stood at the edge of the stone courtyard as the sun set behind the hills, watching Daniel remove his coat, watching Victor Hale do the same across the open space, and felt a fear settle into her bones unlike anything Owen or his men had ever managed to create in her. This was not a chase she could outrun. This was not a border she could cross to escape it. This was the entire weight of 5 years distilled into one single confrontation, and she had no control over the outcome at all. The fight began the way most confrontations between powerful men begin, with a long, tense circling, each testing the other's balance, each waiting for the smallest opening. Victor moved first, fast and vicious, a strike aimed low that Daniel barely managed to sidestep, and the sound of impact when Victor's fist grazed his shoulder made Ella's whole body flinch. Daniel answered with a strike of his own, quick and controlled, and for several long minutes the two men traded blows across the stone courtyard, neither gaining a clear advantage, both breathing hard, both bleeding from small cuts that had opened along cheekbones and knuckles. Ella watched, hands pressed to her mouth, unable to look away even though every part of her wanted to close her eyes and wait for it to be over. She noticed something the longer the fight continued, something that made her chest tighten with a different kind of fear entirely. Victor was not fighting fair. He used the shadows at the edge of the courtyard to hide small, illegal movements, a hidden blade at his wrist he had not declared before the fight began, small advantages that violated every rule the old laws were meant to enforce. Ella's eyes caught the glint of metal just as Victor lunged, and she screamed a warning before she could stop herself. Daniel twisted at the last possible second, the blade catching his forearm instead of his chest, a line of red blooming instantly across his sleeve. He staggered back, and Victor pressed the advantage, driving forward with a speed that finally proved he had never intended to fight within the rules at all. The gathered leaders erupted into shouts of protest, several stepping forward to intervene at the sight of the hidden weapon. But Ella did not wait for the rules to catch up to the danger unfolding in front of her. She grabbed the nearest object within reach, a heavy iron torch stand from the edge of the courtyard, and swung it hard against Victor's shoulder, just as he raised the blade for a second strike. The impact staggered him, and Daniel, given the half-second he needed, drove forward with everything he had left, disarming Victor with a brutal twist of his wrist that sent the hidden blade clattering across the stone ground. The older pack leader who had spoken earlier stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp with authority. "This challenge is void. Victor Hale has violated the sacred terms of combat by concealing a weapon, and by these old laws, such a violation forfeits every claim he brought before this gathering." Victor's face twisted with fury, but he was surrounded now, the other leaders closing in, their expressions no longer neutral, but openly hostile toward a man who had just proven, in front of every witness who mattered, exactly the kind of leader he truly was. You cannot simply erase 5 years of rightful claim over one broken rule, Victor snarled, clutching his injured shoulder. I believe I just did, the older leader said coldly. And I believe every pack in this room will remember tonight, the next time you request an alliance, a trade agreement, or so much as a border crossing through neutral territory. Victor looked around the courtyard, at faces that had once tolerated him out of fear or convenience, now looking back at him with something closer to contempt, and for the first time since Ella had known him, she watched something in him falter, some certainty crack that he had carried his entire life like armor. He looked at her one final time, and whatever he saw in her face, standing tall beside Daniel, with an iron torch, stand still gripped in her hands, seemed to finally convince him that the woman he remembered leaving 5 years ago no longer existed in any form he could reclaim. He turned and walked away without another word, Owen and the rest of his men falling in behind him, and the courtyard remained silent until the sound of their car engines faded completely into the night. Daniel turned to her immediately, his uninjured hand cupping her face, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I am not the one bleeding," she said, gently taking his injured arm to examine the cut along his forearm. "It is not deep," Daniel said. "I have had worse." "That is not exactly reassuring," Ella said, though something in her chest had finally begun to unclench, loosening a knot that had been tightening steadily for 5 straight years. Around them, the gathered leaders slowly returned to the hall, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed, about a king who had fought to protect a woman rather than to claim her, and about a fallen leader who would likely spend years rebuilding whatever trust he had just destroyed in a single reckless move. Mira and Sam, who had traveled to the gathering at Daniel's quiet request to serve as witnesses, found them near the edge of the courtyard, relief plain on both their faces at the sight of the fight finally over. "It is done," Mira said softly, taking in the sight of Victor's absent presence and Daniel's steady stance beside Ella. "It is done," Daniel agreed. Ella looked up at the darkening sky, stars beginning to emerge over the hillside, and felt something settle inside her that she had not felt in 5 long years of running. Not safety exactly, because she understood now that safety was never a place you arrived at and stayed forever. It was something you built, carefully, deliberately, with people willing to stand beside you when the ground beneath your feet turned dangerous again. They stayed in Busan for another week, while Daniel's arm healed, and the gathering's aftermath settled across the wider network of allied packs. Word spread quickly of Victor Hale's disgrace, and within days, reports came in of leaders within his own territory beginning to question his fitness to rule at all. Ella spent that week doing something she had not done in 5 years. She stayed in one place, under her own name, without checking exits or counting footsteps in hallways. She helped Mira restock her clinic, learned to make the noodle broth that had filled the stairwell with its smell that first frightening night, and found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember. On their final evening in the city, she and Daniel walked along the harbor, the same kind of harbor she had fled from in Lisbon weeks earlier, except this time nobody was chasing her toward a departing ferry. "What happens now?" she asked, watching the lights reflect off the dark water. "That depends entirely on you," Daniel said. "I will not pretend I do not want you to come back with me, to build something real in the territory that was always meant to be as much yours as mine. But I also will not pretend that decision belongs to anyone except you." Ella considered this for a long moment, watching a small fishing boat rock gently against the dock, thinking of Grace's guest house and Mira's clinic and Sam's boat repair shop, all the quiet people who had helped her survive 5 years of running without ever once asking her to explain why she needed to run in the first place. "I do not want a quiet life because I am hiding anymore," she said finally. "I want a quiet life because I chose it, with people who make me feel like disappearing was never actually the safest option to begin with." "Is that a yes?" Daniel asked, something hopeful breaking through his careful composure for the first time since the cliff. "It is a maybe," Ella said, a small smile finally tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But it is a maybe that starts with you understanding that I am not coming home to become a king's shadow. I am coming home because I choose to build something beside you, not underneath you." Daniel took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers the way he had on the dock 3 nights earlier, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them at all. "I would not want you standing anywhere except beside me," he said. "I learned that the hard way. Across 3 continents in 5 years I can never get back." They stood together at the edge of the harbor as the last of the evening light faded into full dark. 2 people who had once lost each other to fear and distance, now choosing, deliberately and without illusions, to walk forward into whatever came next side by side. Somewhere behind them, an ocean and a continent away, Victor Hale's territory continued to unravel without him at its head, and somewhere ahead of them, a life waited that Ella had never quite believed she would be allowed to have. For the first time in 5 years, she was not running toward the next hiding place. She was simply walking, steady and unafraid, toward home.